I do want to make some remarks to fully recognize the program that brings us here today. So, first of all, welcome everyone. I'm Ivana Cvetković-Bajrović. I'm the Associate Director for Europe here at the Endowment. And on the behalf of NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies, I would like to welcome you this afternoon to the presentation titled Building Democratic Resilience in the Western Balkans by our Reagan Fasel Fellow Agon Maliqi from Kosovo. Funded by the United States Congress, the Reagan Fasel Democracy Fellows Program hosts some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, scholars, and journalists to conduct independent research and pursue projects here at NED. The program has hosted more than 300 fellows from over 90 countries since it was founded in 2001. And within this remarkable group, and it is always truly remarkable, our speaker stands today for an unwavering commitment to democracy in Kosovo and the Balkans. And will I be mistaken if I say he's the first fellow from Kosovo? Yes, okay. The first fellow from Kosovo. So Agon's country is small, but its significance and the significance of the entire region where it's situated could very well be global. The region remains troubled. We were just counting a few minutes ago how many events dedicated to the Western Balkans have taken place over the span of less than a month, starting in mid-April, and I think that we counted 12, some closed or some. So I'm very impressed by the crowd that we have here. Thank you everyone for coming. The democracies in the region, as I think we'll hear today, are backsliding, which is very troubling. And external actors such as Russia and China are offering an alternative, value-based challenge to the West. And Agon will help us to understand these challenges better and all the other challenges that the region is facing, but also offer an idea on how to bolster domestic constituencies for liberal democracy in the Western Balkans. After Agon's brief presentation, we will be joined by two exceptional experts to discuss regional and global geopolitical trends and ways to counter influence to authoritarianism in this region and beyond. So let me just briefly introduce our speakers before I turn over to Agon. You have their full bios in the invitation that you've received. I would just like to highlight a few things that I felt were most important. Agon Maliqi is a policy analyst, civil society activist, and media writer from Pristina. He didn't really have much of a choice than to become what he is, because he comes from a long line and a very prominent family that is dedicated to democracy and is known for its activism. I have long admired his dedication and his intellect, to be precise, since 2007 when we first met. And when he founded, he was still very, very young at the time. When I found out that he had started and co-founded this new platform, Bunker, an Albanian language blog platform that gives voices to new thinkers and young thinkers in Kosovo, I was really thrilled that it gives us an opportunity to work with him more formally. And having him here as a fellow truly is a treat. We're also joined today by Molly Montgomery, Vice President at Albright Stonebridge Group's Europe practice. I have to admit that we have not met until today, and I find it astonishing, considering that her lengthy career in the White House and the State Department is as long as mine here at NED, maybe even longer. And this, of course, included the Western Balkans. I did some very diligent research on who would be a great contributor to our discussion, and I was really impressed with everything I was able to find about Molly. Formerly a special advisor to the Vice President for Europe and Eurasia and the Deputy Director of the Office of Eastern European Affairs at the State Department, Molly is definitely someone who will have much to contribute to our discussion today, and I hope we stay in touch after this. And finally, a dear friend, and something he always thinks is silly to point out, but a Twitter star he is, Jasmin Mujanovic. I can say that I knew Jasmin before he had 30,000 followers on Twitter, and before all these people wanted to hear what he had to say. Some of us had the privilege of hearing what he had to say when that group was much smaller. Today he is extremely popular and sought after. He's a published author of a book, a go-to policy analyst for organizations such as Freedom House, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, many, many others, and a frequent commentator in leading media such as New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, and others, many others. So we're really happy to have you at NED again. Last time we had you here was for another fellow presentation, and so this is great to have you again here. So we will now turn the floor over to Agon. He will speak for approximately, I'll say 15 minutes, even though my notes say 10. This way, if you expect 15 and you get 10, you'll be happier than the other way around. And then that will be followed by a discussion that I will moderate with all three participants here. For those of you on Twitter, because this is being live streamed, I would like to invite you to follow this presentation, but also to participate in it. To the extent that I can accommodate it, I will also take questions that may come in from Twitter. I will try. I can't promise that I'll do. Use hashtag NEDEvents, that's NED events, or by following the forum at Think Democracy or the Endowment at NED. This is always any democracy, so NED democracy. If you've not already done so, please take a moment to silence your phones. And finally, most importantly, actually, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the staff at the forum who have made this, but not only just this event, but the whole program possible. And the person that I specifically want to single out is the research associate Jeremy Langlois, I think I pronounced that correctly, who's really offered vital assistance to the fellowship project and helps Agon with everything on a daily basis. So with that, Agon, please join me.
Is the mic working? Is it okay? All right. Okay. First of all, welcome everyone, and thank you for showing up in such a good number. And thank you, Ivana, for the kind introduction. It's great to see such a big crowd here in, is it okay? Yeah. In DC for another Balkan event, and it's been a busy week for the Balkans, as Ivana mentioned. And I'm afraid it's not for a good reason. And I'm hoping to discuss some of these problems we're facing in my talk here today. You know, the Balkans are usually discussed in the context of the conflicts which started in the 90s and then sort of still kind of problematic, the ethnic disputes. But it's either that or the issue of democratization and rule of law and corruption. And these are the two big challenges that remain up till today, and they are very intertwined. So my focus here today will be on the aspect of democracy, but I think that since they are intertwined, we will end up also in the discussion in the panel talking a lot about the ethnic disputes and the bilateral disputes between the countries. I will try to be brief in around 12 minutes, which is the big challenge, without sounding superficial, and try to strike that middle balance between the people who know about the Balkans and some who might not be very familiar with, especially with the recent developments. So I will talk briefly about what's happening right now, what are the prospects and where are we going, what's the medium-term scenario in the next couple of years, and the most important question, why should the West care? Why should people here in DC care about these developments? And the last but also equally important question of what we can do, especially domestically, to build more democratic resilience. I'll start with a big story, the global story, which you're probably all familiar with, the story of democratic decline. I've put here this chart by Freedom House. You know, they do these aggregate scores on democracy standards for countries. They've been tracking this since the 70s. And according to Freedom House, over the past 12 years, the number of countries who are declining in terms of their aggregate score, in terms of democratic performance or democratic standards, is so the ones who are declining are more than the ones that are improving. We all know this story, the populist wave, people, even citizens themselves kind of being disillusioned with democracy, and leading to this erosion of rights across the board. And this is happening across the globe, and I don't want to dwell too much into that. But I want to focus on what's the Balkan chapter in this story. Where do we fit in as a region? The Balkans were always kind of middle performers in the European context. Worse than the other Eastern European countries that joined the EU earlier, but better than the authoritarian regimes to the east, like Russia or Turkey. And over the past 12 years, this is on the left, I have the average score for the 6 Western Balkan countries since 2007. You've seen that the Balkans were gradually improving as we were supposedly on the path to EU accession. But then from 2014 and 2015, there's the sharp decrease or sort of worsening of the situation. And the table to the right shows, the situation by countries and where the sort of the problems are the biggest. The sharpest drop in the score, Freedom House score, has been in Serbia, which has decreased by 13 points, followed by Bosnia and Herzegovina by 7, and then Montenegro by 6. So there's 2 or 3 different stories here. There are the ones that are backsliding more seriously, and then there's the ones that are stagnating, which is like Albania and Kosovo over the past 5 years. And then North Macedonia, which was backsliding and now has started to kind of, there's a different narrative now, especially since the last election. But in total, the region is facing quite a lot of trouble. And Serbia, especially being the biggest, and in many ways, sort of a very relevant country because of its, how it impacts the entire region, is very problematic. So what does it look like in reality? I call this current situation, or this deadlock where we find ourselves, a little bit of like an illiberal equilibrium situation. We have governments that win elections, so they have that legitimacy, at least electoral, but the choice is actually limited. It's because once they are in power, they get just enough votes to sort of get to power, but once they're there, they use all of the resources and institutions in a way to strengthen their power and sort of make it impossible for other alternatives to emerge. So a mix of state capture, weak institutions, oligarchy, contributing also to media control, and also unappealing oppositions. For example, in Montenegro, the opposition, being a sort of a pro-Russia proxy, does not really offer an alternative to the strongman regime of Milo Đukanović. So the second big structural problem of why we are in this illiberal equilibrium is the bilateral disputes that I mentioned between the countries. And in case of Bosnia, the continued sort of ethnic dispute between the various ethnic communities there, which feeds into the strongmen or the authoritarians in the country, because it allows them to play identity politics constantly in election times, raise tensions whenever they find it convenient, and present themselves as the security, the person who will keep them safe. And in a lot of the countries, these are the more nationalist, the more right-wing politicians. And the third key factor for this illiberal equilibrium we find ourselves is the fact that these same strongmen can present themselves to the international community as the people who will keep the peace. So they get a free pass on democratic standards, so long as they do not disrupt regional stability or turn towards other malign actors like Russia. So that kind of really empowers them. What are the prospects? My fear right now, and the reason the issues that I'm looking at here at NED, is in the medium term, I fear that we're going to be going from bad to worse. And this is one of the key reasons is the fact that the Western Balkans do not seem to have EU accession prospect anymore. It's getting increasingly formal, this position that the EU does not want to enlarge anymore, and sort of, it's been softening its language or its promises to the Western Balkans. And this has been clear now with the EPP running in the elections, saying that it will end enlargement. With the Berlin summit last week, between where Chancellor Merkel and the French President Emmanuel Macron kind of failing to give any clear prospects for the Western Balkans. And why this is a problem for the Balkans, that we have a lot of the EU accession has been a very, very important anchor towards democratic reform. And with the loss of this external anchor, we're kind of left on our own democratic forces, which I fear are very weak. The second key problem going ahead is the low prospect to resolve the bilateral dispute, which I said contribute and feed the authoritarian tendencies in our country, because they are very convenient for authoritarians in our region. Kosovo-Serbia talks seem to have failed so far, and if nothing happens within this year, it's really hard to see how anything will happen in the next 2 or 3 years until the new institutions are put in place, and then possibly until we wait for the new U.S. administration. So that kind of, the ball has been, the can has been pushed for the future, and that really creates a very great circumstances for malign actors to kind of disrupt the region. There's another problem is that oftentimes democratic forces, when they win, they have a very hard time to deliver. They, the West especially supports democratic reform until they, until they get into power, but then fails to deliver on those who try to make the change. For example, now North Macedonia has made a huge leap with the name dispute with Greece, and now the EU is not delivering to North Macedonia in terms of starting EU accession negotiations. So someone will fill the vacuum in these next 3 to 4 years or 5, and those will not be positive actors. And that's, with Russia increasingly trying to disrupt the region, with China sort of increasingly active through its corrosive capital, the medium-term scenario does not look good. Why should the West care? Ivana mentioned this briefly. It used to be that it will be enough to say that democracy is just better. We should support democracies, but nowadays we need to make more. We need to adjust to the age, to the changing times, and make arguments in the way that makes sense to politicians today. In this age of great power competition, the Western Balkans could become that that model of illiberal democracy that some of these authoritarian regimes are trying to promote. They're trying to send a message that there are alternatives to liberal democracy, and they could find or create some great models in the Balkans for them. The second biggest reason why people should care is that there's always that potential for a resurgence of ethnic conflicts in the Balkans, and authoritarian regimes are more likely to take things in that direction. And the last thing Europe needs right now is another conflict in its backyard. The third key reason is that, especially this is for US audiences, that the engagement of the US is critically important. Because with Europe being divided in a mess, and I know that the US faces a lot of challenges and problems of its own, and has a lot of these global areas to look at, but without a strong US role, just like in the 90s, the US was critical, and the Balkans are one of the US's foreign policy successes. And without a continued engagement by the US, I'm afraid Europe will not be able to sort of solve these problems. What needs to be done? This is the focus of my work here at NED, to build democratic resilience. I would say that first of all, we need to start domestically in the region, start to reshape the narrative of democratization and progress away from EU accession. We need to start forgetting that will happen, because we've put so much of our energy and of our sort of invested so much in sort of the technical process that we meeting these EU conditions, these technical conditions, that we forgot what democracy is about, and it's about delivering to actually citizens. We need to find a new way to a new narrative for democracy building. Secondly, I think without resolving the bilateral disputes and the ethnic disputes, we will continue to be looking to the past and not looking into the future. That's why it's extremely, extremely important to resolve, especially the Kosovo-Serbia dispute, because it's keeping the entire region hostage, and helping autocrats in both Kosovo and Serbia to sort of consolidate their power. Because as long as there's this idea of a threat or a potential war, the wrong kind of people will be empowered. The third, we need to keep our focus on corruption, which is the autocrat's weakest point. In a talk we had here with one of the top scholars of democracy building, Larry Diamond, I asked him, like, what is the key thing we should focus on? He said corruption, because ultimately all authoritarian regimes, that's their weakest point. We need to, and in a context where they are selling themselves as the true representatives of the people and eroding rights in that name, exposing that hypocrisy and exposing their abuse of power remains the key asset. But we cannot do that without a free media space, which is free and critical. And I think this is one of the main challenges that we cannot do on our own, where we continue to need, especially Western support on the investigative journalism, for example, or on more analytical content. The kind of things, media are facing a problem everywhere around the world. Quality journalism is facing challenges in terms of its business models and sustainability. But in contexts like the Balkans, it is really critical. If you want to change the narrative, if you want to focus on corruption, we need to keep the media space free, But right now, it's becoming especially very tricky, especially in a country like Serbia, which has essentially become a one-man echo chamber under Aleksandar Vučić. We also need to expand the constituency of people who care for liberal democracy. Now, that sounds like very abstract and vague, so I will try to just break down what that means. And this is actually the key focus of my work here at NED. When these autocrats start to erode these rights, oftentimes they find they encounter silence or lack of resistance. What we need to do is that, there was a wonderful article and a controversial article by Ivan Krastev, one of the top thinkers from the region, from Bulgaria, who made this argument that liberal forces in Eastern Europe, he was talking more in the context of Hungary and Poland, have lost a lot of the appeal among the masses because they've been dismissive of nationalism. Now, his argument is not that we need to embrace nationalism and become nationalistic, but we need to talk more in terms that people understand, not by being nationalistic, but by talking in narratives, in national narratives, and making them more inclusive, and getting more people on board, and not letting the masses fall under the authoritarian appeal. We need to. This is the second point is. Especially valid for the left. We need to bridge the gap between the working class concerns and the new sort of progressive causes that have emerged, because oftentimes some of these constituencies should be part of the same movement in resisting authoritarian tendencies, but often what is happening across Eastern Europe is that it's autocrats are able to split these constituencies. In Poland, for example, the labor unions have gone with Kaczynski, for example. And this is happening a lot also in the Balkans, where a lot of these people who should be part of the progressive movement are often in antagonism with one another. Third, and this is one of the things that I find closest to heart, is we need to reform a little bit the democracy assistance infrastructure for civil society. Some of the most active sort of resistance against authoritarian regimes in the Balkans, but also across Eastern Europe, has come from this second generation of civil society, the more informal, loose social movements. And I don't think the support infrastructure that is in place kind of targets them. The old school traditional NGOs are in a way, no matter how much good work they do, and I'm part of that world as well, are also now part of the problem. We need to rebuild legitimacy and reconnect with the grassroots and take a bit more of that venture capital approach when financing and supporting civil society. Last but not least, we need to work more with the private sector, because a lot of the region, in the region, we have a lot of newly emerging industries and private sector that now that has a vested interest in the rule of law, but it's not properly connected with the other constituents or people who have a vested interest in democracy. And we need to work much more better, have a stronger emphasis in this part of the work. So, having spent my dedicated time, I will end there, and this is like a brief introduction. We will touch upon these. We will go more granular on a lot of these issues in the panel, but I just wanted to kind of outline what the challenges are and where we need to be looking at in the future. So thank you. I went overboard, right?
No. Good. Thank you, Agon. I think this works, yes. So the way that we're going to do this portion of the event today is that I will moderate a discussion with all three participants, and I have lots of questions that I would like to ask. I don't know if we'll have the time for all of them, but I'll try. And then at the top of the hour, my plan is, we'll see, I will open it up for the audience to ask questions. I think that by that point, I'm hoping that we will have inspired you to ask so many questions that, and then I will introduce another set of rules on how that is to be done. So, but let me begin with Mali first. Again, like I said, I had lots of questions to ask, but since I mentioned that there have been 12 events, or will be in total 12 events on the Western Balkans, we were discussing earlier what warrants that. Was this just a coincidence that people were in town, or is there really reason to worry? And we can, I think, dissect that a little bit more in our discussion, but one of the words that keeps coming up all the time is vacuum. And Agon also used it in his presentation. And basically the premise is that the reason why we're seeing some of the democratic backsliding in the region, and particularly the inflow of other influence, the not so positive influence, as Agon mentioned, is that the US and the EU have left a vacuum. And I think it's fair to say that the attention of the United States has shifted away from the region. Certainly it's not what it used to be in the immediate after-war period. But I wanted to ask you, as somebody who worked in the government, is it fair to say that we left a vacuum? Or how would you characterize really our absence? If, you know, to what extent are we absent? And also to ask, in the political reality of Washington, is it really realistic for policymakers, decision makers in Washington to pay attention to this region when there's so many other things in the world that are far more important? And if so, why, or if not?
Well, I think it's a really good question. Is my mic on? Yeah. Okay. It's a really good question, and I would say no, it's not a complete vacuum, but certainly we're not present and haven't been present for some time in the way that we were in, you know, the late 90s, early 2000s. I think there are good reasons for that. You know, part of it is this cycle that we see in any post-conflict situation where there, you know, is a ton of attention, funding, presence, and over time, you know, as the situation improves, as institutions are set up that appear to be functioning well enough, some of that attention, you know, does go away. There's fatigue. Right now we have Ukraine fatigue, but, you know, there has been Balkans fatigue in the past. And so, you know, part of this is the natural cycle. What we haven't figured out how to do is to do sustainment. We talk about it in terms of the military and security, but we don't talk about it in terms of democracy. So we haven't figured out how do we build these institutions that undergird a democracy. You talked about corruption, so rule of law, civil society, media, and then how do we, you know, work with those institutions, with activists, with politicians, to make sure that they continue to function even as influence goes down. You know, I would say as well that sometimes there is an element of, you know, you get used to the attention. We all like attention, right? Even on a personal basis. And, you know, the more we get, the more we want. And sometimes there is also an element of needing to be weaned off of the attention a little bit and knowing that, you know, you have to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. So I think it's a mix. I would also say, in terms of the second part of your question, what should Washington be doing? What are fair expectations? The formula that we've seen that works, particularly in the Western Balkans, but also in other places, is that when you have the United States and the EU working together with clear goals and expectations, that formula is effective. And that doesn't require either party to give too much. It requires us to invest in, you know, being united, setting common priorities, and that works. And so I would say that's something that I do think is in the realm of the possible in the future. Perhaps not so much with this administration, but, you know, I certainly hope that that's something we'll see going forward.
So, I mean, I see where you're coming from, and I think that certainly we have evidence of how this can work really well when both parties are in sync, if you will. But I think those of us, at least from the NGO side who are looking at this, would argue that maybe the US had prematurely turned things over to the EU. And there was a lot of this expectation that maybe the sustainment on democracy was going to just happen through the EU accession process. And that really didn't really happen. So let me turn to Yasmin then, and someone who's watching the interplay of foreign actors, both Western and Eastern, in the region, and somebody who looks at the EU's role in the region. Why do you think this didn't happen? So, you know, I think that it was a fair thing that the US did, and in expecting the EU to handle this problem, if you will. And things are not going so well. Why?
Well, because accession and enlargement aren't and weren't what our European friends thought they were, right? And that became clear, I think, very early on, although the implications didn't manifest until arguably relatively recently in sort of grand historical terms, if we're talking about the last decade or so. Realistically speaking, the accession process is a technical process. It's a process of streamlining institutions, bringing institutions into a kind of shared compact, and creating institutional frameworks for a kind of continental administration. I mean, that's sort of the most basic conservative way that we can describe the European project. Of course, in the long run, it's supposed to imply and result in a kind of sustained, meaningful democratic transformation. But that is something that takes, to borrow Molly's language here, sustainability. And that requires a kind of engagement that had to continue. And here we're not even strictly talking about the Western Balkans, we're talking about the whole of Eastern Europe, and sort of more broadly the post-communist world. It had to continue even once membership was achieved. Right? And so this is where we find that linkage between, for instance, the situation that we're seeing in places like Hungary or Poland or even Bulgaria and Romania, these countries that are NATO member states, that are EU member states, but obviously their own democratic regimes are in the midst of a very, very serious crisis. And so when you're thinking about the Western Balkans, which had not only the experience of one-party authoritarianism for several decades and generations, and going back even further, if we're really going to do sort of a deep historical dive, which I love doing, but we don't have time. We had added on top of that the problem of war, which most of Eastern Europe, essentially all of it, did not, at least anywhere on the level that we saw in the Balkans, especially when you're thinking about places like Kosovo or Bosnia-Herzegovina, which saw tremendous degrees of violence. So the engagement that was required on both the European and American end, needed to be much more, let's not even necessarily say thorough, but certainly much more sustainable and longer term than unfortunately what happened in practice.
And it wasn't, and we are where we are, and I think that this is one of the reasons that prompted Agon to propose that one of the ways of going forward and addressing some of these issues is to reshape the narrative of democratization away from the EU. I think that there are quite a few people in Washington who are thinking this way. But I think it's unrealistic for the EU to just completely give up on the region. I think at least nominally there's still commitment. And so my question to you is, at this point where we are right now, can the EU do anything differently to have the transformative effect on this region the way that it did in Central Europe? Can you imagine a situation in which this can happen, and what would it look like?
It does not seem very realistic, and this was very visible now in the Berlin summit just 2 days ago. There's a big divide between Germany and France over the future of Europe, and the French are especially right now, in a way, the problem in this, because their view is there will be no enlargement until the EU reforms internally. Germany had this idea in the project, especially with the Berlin process, of first of all connecting the region, the regional countries with one another, and then kind of starting a process from there, improving governance standards, and then everybody joins. And in the last EU strategy, they even proposed some dates, like 2025, for some countries like Serbia and Montenegro potentially joining. But I don't think this will happen. And it was clear now they're now not even mentioning the word enlargement anymore in any of the communiques or something like that. But so they're leaving us in this idea, in this context where the words are there, the promises are there, but it's all empty. And this is it's a very delicate and dangerous moment, and that's why I fear that this is a turning point for the region, because we saw what happens when you lose that EU anchor. We saw that, for example, with Turkey in 2005, when it got the clear signal that it will not join. Erdogan used that to kind of shift the country in a different direction, used that for identity politics domestically. And we saw also what it means for EU members when they lose that anchor. Like, people who are studying this, even Poland and Hungary, the EU has more tools to discipline you when you're trying to get in than when you're actually inside. So the backsliding in Hungary and Poland happened after they joined. So I fear that we will now be stuck in this. We needed that external pressure. It helped us a lot in terms of democracy. The problem is that now people are angry at the EU. For progressives are angry at the EU. Even I am angry at the EU as a very I used to be a very strong EU supporter. Now I'm kind of maybe becoming an EU realist, not necessarily EU skeptic. I'm not there. I'm not at Brexit level yet, but there's that Brexit. You know, a colleague wrote this on Twitter the other day. There's like a Brexit atmosphere right now in the Balkans, which, you know, even without going in, because people feel disillusioned. People feel disillusioned. The EU, you know, conditionality works only once the EU gives conditions and then also delivers to the Western Balkan countries, and it hasn't done that. With North Macedonia as a clear case, you know, they went through all of that process to change the government and overcome state capture, and change the name, and now they will not even want them. They don't even want them to start negotiations. It's not even. It's not like they're going to join right now. It's opening accession talks, which could last forever. Same with Albania. Albania did a massive justice sector reform, and there was no delivery from Brussels. So they don't want to start. Not to mention my home country of Kosovo, which hasn't got visa liberalization. You know, it's the only country in Europe not to be able to travel freely in EU, even though we fulfill the technical conditions. So if they're not willing to even do that, they have betrayed all the progressive forces in the region, and you know, and turned them against the EU. And I think that's why this is a really delicate and problematic moment.
So meanwhile, the people in Berlin are some people that are quite problematic in the democratic aspect. And I also maybe want to even challenge this idea that you say, you know, if you lose the EU anchor, and to see what does EU anchor really mean. I think that here at Endowment, everybody's in agreement that the EU accession process provides a very useful framework for the democracy assistance work that we're doing. But it's increasingly difficult again to think of this process as being transformative as it was. And one of the biggest challenges, and one of the ways that we really design a lot of the programs here, is in this context of commitment to the EU. And I think that the fact of the matter is that nominally, all the leaders in the region have committed to the EU accession process. But in reality, there's quite a bit of room for doubt that they really are committed to this. And Yasmin, in your book, Hunger and Fury, you introduced a very useful concept of elastic authoritarianism. I think people should read the book to get the full gist of it. But briefly, what does that mean? And particularly in the context of the EU, how do these rising authoritarians basically adjust themselves to meet whatever requirements to get invited to Berlin, when in fact they're really not doing what is required of them?
So I think the shortest way to explain it is simply this, that historically speaking, Balkan elites have made a career of being clients. They're very, very good clients. They're very, very good at accommodating much bigger powers. And so what they've learned to do over the past century and a half is essentially whoever the great power in the region is at that given moment to say, we buy into your project, we believe it completely, we'll be loyal to the end until they actually realize the end is nigh. Balkan elites are much more astute and critical, and I would say sober in this way, as to what the actual realpolitik conditions of international politics are. They begin to recognize when various kinds of transnational, let's call them, projects, global projects are fraying, or regional projects are fraying, and they start to look for new benefactors. So the Balkan elite concluded much earlier than I think a lot of people in the West did, that the European project, at least as it currently exists, was fundamentally in crisis. And so when we're thinking presently about why is it that Russia has suddenly become a factor in the Western Balkans, why is Turkey suddenly a factor once again, and then we start talking about the UAE, other, I mean, even more imminent or immediate neighborhood states like Hungary. Why is Hungary investing in the Slovenian media market? These kinds of things. Why is this happening? Well, it's because Balkan elites are advertising themselves as being in want, in desire, in need of new benefactors, and saying, we'll buy into your project. So if you're thinking, for instance, about this very alarming, I would call it, quote unquote, Russification of public space in places like Serbia, parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, where is this suddenly manifesting, these mythologized relations, supposedly between Russia and the Western Balkans? It's because local elites are saying, yes, we're looking for a pivot point. And also, specifically, the reason why they do this is is that they can play these blocks off against each other. All right, I mean, they all learned from Tito, right? You know, this is what the non-aligned movement was, and so there's a real political school in the Balkans, as it were, as far as sort of international and foreign policy is concerned. And so, even though we're talking about relatively small actors, when we're talking about, you know, even in countries like Serbia or you know, Montenegro, Bosnia, Croatia, even. Realistically speaking, these are small states, but they're very, very capable in terms of how they're able to manage the international arena for their own benefits. And I think presently that is a huge dynamic of what's going on right now vis-a-vis the relationship with the EU in particular.
So with the picture painted so direly, my question is there a reason for us to believe that these elites, which are very entrenched, have an alternative? And one of the things that Agon mentioned in his presentation is that there should be support for democratic forces and a greater recognition to supporting some of these forces. And when I look at the opposition and alternatives across the region, there isn't much hope to be had. I have to say, you mentioned this word Russification, and the two protest movements that I can think of right now we're looking at the opposition that is just as Russified or more in some cases as the governments. From someone sitting in Washington, this is a scary prospect. And so this is my question to you, Agon, maybe. When you look at some of the things that are happening in Serbia, Republika Srpska, Montenegro, what can we really hope for? Who do we support?
Serbia, it's a big problem. There's a big protest movement now against Aleksandar Vučić, which, you know, and the problem is that the opposition, if they were to come to power, I think it would have been better for Serbia in terms of weakening the sort of the capture of the state, but it would not change one of the key problems, which is Serbia's policy towards the region, because the opposition parties are consisted also of very right-wing, they have their right-wing elements and pro-Russia factors there as well. So I don't think it will solve anything. So, and I think this is one of the problems, the issues why the protest movement has not grown into something bigger is that many people in Serbia, I think there's that middle ground that doesn't see them as a real alternative. You know, they can bring in quite some numbers on the streets, but many people see that this is the same old. So it will be just changing one nationalist party with another. So I don't see any hope in the current protest movement in Serbia. And this is one of the key problems in this illiberal equilibrium that I mentioned. The oppositions being part of the problem. Destructive factors capturing opposition parties essentially. And then just using that, for them, for example, in Albania, or it's enough for them to just have control the opposition and have that amount of power and use that for their own personal leverage, rather than opening up the space for other actors. Or so, in a way, the oppositions are also captured by regressive elements and play along with a lot of the malign actors in many cases, like in Montenegro, and also including in Serbia as well.
So you mentioned the malign actors, so I'd like to switch gears because we're starting to already run out of time. Like I said, lots to cover. But so as we've just described, there's lots to play with. And one of the biggest players or one of the biggest actors who would like to play in the Balkans is Russia. And I would like to ask you, Molly, as somebody who's observed the region closely and covered also beyond this region before. I know you cannot know this answer with certainty, but what do you think Russia's strategy is in the Balkans, and for what purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would really look at Russia and think about their primary goal is to create a sphere of influence that they control. So, and that would include, ideally, from their perspective, the former Soviet republics. And then beyond that, if it can be in the sphere of influence, great, but they really want to have a buffer zone between them and the West. Obviously, with the Baltics, in NATO, other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, they're not going to be able to do that anytime soon. But that is really what we see when we look at, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, is the effort to create that sphere of influence, to use whatever levers they have to destabilize if necessary, to ensure that those states remain friendly to them. And then as you go a little bit further, i.e. into the Western Balkans, what you see is they're using a usually slightly lighter version of the same toolkit, let's say, to try to prevent the countries of the Western Balkans from moving west. So, spheres of influence and self-determination don't go very well together. And so Russia wants to do whatever it can to make sure that even people who have, chosen a westward path, that they're not able to move forward. So obviously we saw the attempted coup in Montenegro a couple of years ago. That was the starkest example of tactics that I think we all thought were pretty beyond the pale. Were beyond the pale and were surprising to us, I think, in their intensity, let's say. But you see disinformation, you see corruption, you see all of these tactics that are part of the Russian toolkit being used now in the Western Balkans in an effort to just sow disunity, sow chaos, a lack of progress, and to be able to maintain some leverage. But if they can't maintain leverage, then they just want everybody to be, countries to be weak, dependent, and unable to move forward with things like EU accession.
So historically the Balkans has been at the kind of intersection of a variety of interests and influences, and we don't have time to go into all of them right now, but maybe just briefly on China. I'm really interested, especially since you mentioned Montenegro. Do you think that enough attention has been paid to China in the region, and how do you assess its presence there? Do you think that its influence is being understated and just focused on economic when being analyzed, or is there something more for us to worry about there?
Yeah, I think as we look at Chinese influence and investments globally, there's been this perception that it's just economic, we don't need to worry about it. That's starting to change. Obviously, the US has already changed its view on that. The EU is in the process of doing so, and I think the countries of the Western Balkans would be wise to do the same. Because what we're learning is that there is no such thing as just economics, right? It's all political. And so we see investments, particularly from the Chinese, in infrastructure. Greece is a really good example. The port of Piraeus, other very strategic investments that, if the Chinese control, then they have a lot of leverage. They have a strategic foothold. And so I think we need to think about Chinese investment, both, the debt trap idea has been very well publicized. I think that's what most developing countries have been worried about. But I think we also need to, when we look at a region that's geostrategic like the Western Balkans, we need to be thinking about those infrastructure investments, other key investments that really, in the long term, will enable the Chinese to play a much larger role and a much more political role than they do now.
So I will use this opportunity to make a plug for an upcoming report that our colleagues at the International Forum have worked with a renowned analyst from the region, Kurt Bassiner, to publish. It is, to my understanding, not public yet, but I do have a nice color copy of it here that I invite you to take a look at in the next few days. I think it's coming out. Tomorrow it's coming out. It's titled Pushing on an Open Door, Foreign Authoritarian Influence in the Western Balkans. What strikes me is that a lot of what we discussed here is going to be captured, but even more broadly, because other foreign actors will be treated here as well. But it really talks about this fertile ground that was created by the absence of Western powers, to which a lot of these malign foreign actors are now using to their own benefit. So please take a look at it tomorrow. And I'm going to now take this last few minutes to do something that I promised on Twitter I will do, and that is to raise a very controversial issue. And the reason why I'm using this as a segue is because these two foreign powers, Russia and China in particular, I think, in my view, have a lot more at stake than just the economic side. And one particular issue that both of them are very interested in is the Kosovo-Serbia relations. I think we can all agree to that. And by now, I think everybody knows that this is a process that has taken a long time. It's really essentially an impasse. And then all of a sudden, last year put maybe at kind of like a momentum of North Macedonia, there was a potential for a breakthrough. The breakthrough, however, involved a very controversial potential land swap deal. And here today we have two gentlemen who have quite opposing views on the benefits, the potentials, the potential to resolve the situation in the region through this particular deal. And we're not going to have the time that we would need. This would require a whole lot of events to hear both of their arguments. I would like to turn the tables on them and challenge their views. I think that some of you may know where I stand in the argument. I'm not going to try to inject my views here. But let me begin with Agon. So I know you support this deal. So, well, let's put it this. No, you don't support this deal, but you believe that if a deal is not made in the next few months, that this might be the last opportunity for Kosovo to basically move away from this situation in which it finds itself as a not fully recognized state and not fully functional state. And so even there might be issues with this particular deal, let's put it that way, it might be the best Kosovo is going to get in a long time to come. And the challenge I have for you, the question that I want to ask you, is that the two men that are at the heart of this deal, one in particular, are less than ideal as in terms of their democracy commitment. One at least can be described as a rising authoritarian. And what my question to you is that aren't you worried a little bit that not just the fact that they are the ones leading the negotiations are giving them the legitimacy that perhaps we shouldn't in light of everything that we spoke about, but also while they're doing that the West, which is very kind of invested in this deal, may be letting them get away with some things internally that they shouldn't be getting away with?
Very fair point. My worry is exactly the opposite, that if we don't have the deal, they'll be more empowered. I'm conditionally have been sort of open to it. This is not Kosovo's preferred option. Kosovo does not want this. Kosovo is looking for ways, and I hope we prevent it from happening. But my worry is exactly the opposite, that if the status quo is prolonged, if we don't solve this now, we will keep this thing open. And this is the perfect scenario for both strong men in the upcoming years and decades, because they thrive on this, on having Serbia as a threat. Domestically, I'm talking about the Kosovo, and in Serbia as well. They thrive on having this issue open because they can, Vučić can present himself as the protector, as the patriot. I'm the one who will keep this, So the worry is exactly the opposite. If they don't solve it now, then we'll face those problems. Thaçi is, the president, Kosovo's president, who's leading this on the side. He's in his sort of twilight, I would say. The very fact that he couldn't sell this domestically shows that he's not as powerful, or as he's going down for good reason. A very big majority is happy with that. And this is maybe one good thing that he could do at the end. That's why I've been conditionally supportive, because I really think that having no deal is the worst option, because both for the reasons domestically, internally for democracy, but also for security reasons, because having this issue unresolved is these bilateral disputes are the thing that Russia thrives on. We saw that in Macedonia, Greece. They thrive in just sowing discord. Whatever dispute there is in the Balkans, you see their media. They're just pushing the narrative of just you people, you just fight with one another, and potentially, if possible, start a conflict. They at some point, they will, if they want to escalate, they will also want to do that. So without this being solved, I really feel we're giving them more ammo in the next coming years, and I think this is the thinking in the current U.S. administration, that this has to be solved now. Because if we don't, we leave it to an uncertain future where the EU is unable, it's in a mess, and then we need to solve, we need to cut the cord right now. And the problem is that we came to this land swap. It's because the West, the US included in some cases, has for almost a decade, tried to accommodate Serbia at the expense of the neighbors, the pro-Western neighbors, by sort of saying, hey, we can, and now we are in a position where Kosovo has to give something in return for Serbia's recognition, and we, in a way, need that recognition, because we cannot enter NATO. We're blocked. We're in international limbo without that. So there are pragmatic and practical reasons that kind of made me at least consider this option, or and not be sort of but with two conditions. One being that it be very symbolic in terms of the scope of the exchange, like a technical demarcation, which I think was or is one of the ideas. That does not include North Mitrovica, which was ethnically cleansed, and we do not legitimize ethnic cleansing. That stays part of Kosovo. And two, making sure that it does not have regional repercussions, especially in Bosnia. I know that is tricky to argue that that could happen, because this is one of the reasons why there's been quite a lot of resistance against the deal, and why I find myself in a minority, not just in Kosovo, but also internationally, in making this kind of argument. But really making sure that people in Bosnia do not use this as an excuse to restart, or like for the secessionist movement in Republika Srpska use this. That is, if these two conditions are met, then I'd rather have this agreement pass now rather than leave this for an uncertain future and leave a frozen conflict in Europe's backyard. And I think that's the thinking also here in the US.
So those are big ifs. And a bigger if that I would like to add to your ifs is that ultimately for recognition you will need a buy-in of the two foreign forces, malign influence actors that we just spoke about, and I think nobody can really secure those. But
at least 5 EU countries, 5 EU non-recognizers and NATO non-recognizers, that could be solved. That's good enough.
So I see he's dying to say something. So I know that one of the ifs is the big if that the reason why actually Yasmin is very worried about this deal, and that is the potential repercussions to the region. But I don't want you to talk about that so much. I really want you to respond to what Agon's, I think, valid point was, that as long as this remains an issue, that it gives an excuse to the likes of Vučić and others, Dodik, to basically sacrifice all the rule of law and other issues, and to just use this constantly as a way to stay in power and to, so, don't you buy in some of the arguments that Agon is making, at least when it comes to that?
I completely buy, and this is the wrong way to put it, I'm extremely sympathetic to Agon's frustration, and I'm extremely sympathetic and empathetic to the frustrations of Kosovars more generally about the situation that they're in, and that the international community, and in particular the EU, has helped accommodate. That having been said, this is not a matter of the devil being in the details, because what we're talking about is not details. This is a structural question. So this is, the devil is on the billboard. So here's the issue. What matters here is how these disputes are resolved. And I take very big exception to the idea that there is or should be a comparison drawn between what Hashim Taci and Aleksandar Vučić have been shopping around vis-a-vis the Prespa agreement. Because that was an agreement that was made between two democratic governments, democratically elected governments, that went through parliamentary institutional procedure, that had a very transparent, albeit very charged environment that it took place in. I mean, it was a hugely emotional issue. Arguing that we're going to go down the road of partition, which is, I will put my cards out on the table, I think is the more appropriate term about what we're talking about here. It's not a border swap, it's partition. We historically know how partitions end, is putting very much the cart before the horse. If the concern is with democratic legitimation and democratic institutions and civil society, I don't understand why or how these states will suddenly become more democratic after the fact, when the problem itself, the apparent structural problem, will have been resolved in a fundamentally undemocratic fashion, that will not have been transparent, won't have involved civil society, and ultimately will reify the kinds of international politics that states like Russia and China want, which is essentially great power bargains, spheres of influence, lines in the sand, have a chunk of territory here, we'll give you this, you'll give us that. I mean, this is 19th century politics. And from the American perspective, this is sort of categorically what this country historically has opposed. The United States has historically committed itself to creating frameworks for problem resolution, for politics, for debate that have been based on values and practices and principles, none of which we see in what is presently being proposed vis-a-vis this partition scheme. And that, again, is to not at all even touch the matter, which I think is a huge matter, of what's going to happen with Bosnia-Herzegovina, what's going to happen with North Macedonia, what's going to happen with Albania. I mean, to call it a Pandora's box doesn't do it justice to me. I mean, the metaphor that I've often used is essentially the argument that Vučić and Taci are giving right now is, look it, there's a Belgrade-Pristina dialogue. We can't make it work. We can't even agree to freedom of movement among our citizens. So we're having a hard time juggling 3 balls. But here's our idea. Give us 3 chainsaws, we'll set them on fire, and we'll juggle those instead. On what planet Does anyone believe that that's going to work? I mean, seriously. And the final point that needs to be made is I think we need to be extremely observant of the fact how destabilizing the mere airing of this idea has already been. I mean, simply look at what's happened in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Banja Luka, with the Dodik government over the past year and a half, 2 years since this idea has been aired publicly. Milorad Dodik, every single opportunity that he gets, completely links the idea of the RS and North Kosovo in this context. That's not going to go away. It's just not going to go away.
I know you would love to respond. I promised the audience half an hour for questions, and people are already raising their hands. So I think that you probably...
30 seconds. The liberal,
Here we go.
the liberal in me agrees with Yasmin. The Kosovar in me has doubts because Kosovars agreeing to even talk about this, and that's not all of Kosovo. It's one leader actually. The rest is skeptical. Is a desperation move because that's the only leverage you have. The West has rewarded Serbia for keeping the Kosovo hostage, Bosnia hostage, sort of try to accommodate Serbia. So, and it's created bad incentives. So, I always keep saying, they've been accommodating Vucic, so Hashim Thaci just said, hold my beer, And then he went and played the destabilizing card as well, and now everybody is looking at what's happening with Kosovo. We got the West attention in a desperation move. That's one of the reasons why, from a realist perspective, and we are living in realist times now, that's where the Kosovar in me wins over the liberal, is that these are sometimes you need to make this kind of moves to at least get some attention and hopefully avoid this deal. But as I said, what worries me most is just this thing entirely collapsing and not seeing any way of this being resolved in the upcoming years.
Great. Okay. I was very kind to Agon now and letting him give this response because this is his event. I'm not going to be as kind to the audience. And what that specifically means, everybody can ask a question. We'll probably take 3 at a time because otherwise we will not have the time. Please introduce yourselves and please ask a question because I will interrupt you if you start making a statement. After a second sentence that does not sound like a question, I'm not going to be as nice. Okay, this gentleman in the checkered shirt here, yes, was the first one to raise his hand.
Thank you. I've hiked all over Kosovo. I've been back and forth and crossing the borders between Serbia and Kosovo numerous times.
Who are you?
Oh, I'm sorry. Alan Storm. In a previous life, I was a NATO international staff officer. And it took me 2 years to open up the airspace in the upper airspace over Kosovo. So it took me over 2 years. I love exactly what everybody has been said. But I think I have 2 questions, and I apologize for 2. The first one is, nobody's mentioned the relationship between Albania and Kosovo. Every single ministry that I've been into, besides having a U.S. flag in there, they also have an Albania flag. So if anything would happen with Kosovo and the further recognition, is Kosovo going to have their own identity like many of the other European nations? And number 2, you also mentioned the political piece, but we also have the technical piece. 20 years later, this will be the 20th anniversary, we still have not normalized the airspace over Kosovo. So what kind of activities are we going to ever move to make things more normalized within Kosovo? And again, understanding the politics, but how are we going to also move forward on some of the technical items? And I apologize for the 2 questions.
It's okay, as long as they're asked the way that you did, which was very efficient. Gentleman behind, and then we'll move to Rob here in the second row.
Thank you. Will Ferragaro, Strategy for Humanity Consultancy. The discussion focused a lot on national, regional, and great power politics. When I think of resilience, I'm thinking of on-the-ground democratization and what's happening locally. And so I'm curious, and maybe the news might be a little less distressing. I wondered what you could speak to about what's happening with youth. And Agon, you raised a very intriguing issue of kind of new forms of NGOs and civil society activism. So I wish if you could address some of that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Rob Benjamin here, please, for the first round.
Thank you. Rob Benjamin from NDI, National Democratic Institute. Actually, my question follows a little bit on that. You gave voice to a notion of maybe not divorcing democratization from EU accession, but in a way, kind of, as I would have it, making it a bit more corollary. The EU doesn't necessarily proffer explicit, let's say, structural requirements when it comes to democracy, election systems, political party laws, the ability for parliaments to legislate, oversee, and represent, as they do for the judiciary, as they do for the public administration. So conceivably, there could be, in point of fact, room to create a new type of domestic narrative, going a little bit to what Will's suggesting. And if that's the case, and along the lines of what you generally recommended, what, if any, particular strategy or priorities would you have in that space of, let's call it, political process, to get at your illiberal problem that you're rightly defining?
Okay. Well, so
We'll stop here for now.
okay, I'm very happy you mentioned the airspace problem. It's one among the dozens and hundreds of problems that we face with Serbia. Like, for example, I mean, I don't know, many of you might not know, flights coming to Kosovo have to bypass Serbia because Serbia doesn't recognize Kosovo, so it takes longer to come to Kosovo and it costs more. So that's just one of the problems that arises from, and was one of on the agenda for the Brussels negotiations. But now people have given up on this one by one issue discussions, and they're trying to hit the big issue of recognition, which will in a way kind of hopefully resolve everything. Because there's like tons of these technical issues that have, some of improvement has been made during the Brussels negotiations. The domestic Serbian structures in Kosovo have been integrated into Kosovo's institutions. Progress has been made. Now it has regressed. With the land swap talk, a lot of that has seen some regress. Albania and Kosovo, very tricky question. You cannot, put yourself in my position. 2008, Kosovo declares independence. That's the first day I saw the Kosovo flag. Somebody came to a bar where we were celebrating, said, "This is Kosovo's flag," and we were like, "Yay!" Growing up until 20-something years old with the Albanian flag, it's not just an ethnic, it's a political and cultural identity. People have that flag, and they will continue to have it. It's a dual identity that is emerging, and it's an ongoing debate between Kosovars. I think Kosovar statehood is here to stay. But the more it is assaulted from, the more it is contested, and this is Serbia's aim, to contest as much as possible. And Serbia does not treat Kosovo as it always says Albanians. It does not want to admit that there is such a thing as Kosovo. The more the international community legitimizes it, the more empowered will the pan-Albanian discourse be. But on the other hand, I also don't see anything wrong with having being a citizen also of Albania. I have dual citizenship, of close ties between Kosovo and Albania, and seeing them as relationships between, it's a kind of a special relationship, stronger ties than with others in the region. It's an ongoing debate, but that's why I think consolidating Kosovo's statehood as fast as possible will contribute to sort of, getting the recognition, getting the UN seat will contribute to consolidating Kosovo's statehood. On the youth and the resilience, this question, and I'm not sure I understood very well the last part you had about how the EU, the EU component on that. But I do see a lot of potential, especially in Kosovo, which has the biggest, most youthful population in the Balkans. But most of it is happening so sporadically and so outside of any assistance, international assistance schemes, that it's actually great because it's very grassroots and very genuine. That's why I'm kind of I emphasized also in my presentation that the support infrastructure that is there, I'm not arguing that it should go in now and try to usurp that space and try to make these organizations into formal movements or something like that. But they also need a little bit of a helping hand, because civic space is right now the only more open space in the Balkans. As I said, opposition parties are captured. Most interesting things are happening in civil society, and that's the most important, or like the key entry point right now. We work a lot with youth. Our organization, Bunker, does critical thinking programs all over Kosovo, with young influencers, building young generation human rights activists. Initiatives like these, and we're now increasingly able to mobilize people on single issues, like and you see now these rising protests on like air quality, these middle class concerns. You see more and more people active on these issues. But the biggest gap, I think, is to getting these single issue people to see themselves as part of a bigger picture and to mobilize and see themselves as a constituency broader than those single issues. This is, I think, where we have a big gap, and why we are not seeing. Yasmin can definitely contribute on it because he's written a book on this. So this is, I think, the key challenge will be to get these constituencies together and have this more grassroots approach to democracy building, rather than this technical process of democracy will come with EU accession, and as long as we tick some boxes from this, we meet these European conditions, we are suddenly becoming a democracy, which I think is one of the reasons why people are angry at democracy in the Balkans right now.
So two finger from Yasmin, and then I would really like to go back. I see some hands already.
Yeah, I just I want to use the opportunity to get on a hobby horse that I have that I think is actually hugely important, because oftentimes, especially in these kinds of fora, we're often talking about what is a low cost initiative that international organizations can undertake that has a huge impact, and it gets to the heart of the status of youth in the region. And I think this is a situation in Kosovo, it's a situation in Bosnia, it's a situation across all of the WB6. First of all, let me just sort of preface this by saying I'm not trying to romanticize youth. There are very serious problems among young people in the Western Balkans vis-a-vis regressive reactionary attitudes, having similar norms and values as their parents. All of that stands. But the challenge, and I think the task remaining for the international community vis-a-vis youth to tap into the potential that nevertheless exists for youth, is how do you actually decouple them from those norms and values? And that is actually a very functional physical question. I'll give you a very concrete example. I use it often. There are no safe spaces for young people in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in most of the region. What I mean by that is there are no spaces, or very few spaces, for young people to congregate that are not their home, cafes and shisha bars, right, or bars. So if you're thinking about where can young people go to acquire skills and knowledge, are there libraries? Not really, right? Very few. Are there different kinds of boys and girls clubs? On and off, but not permanent, et cetera, right? And so you see this manifest in all kinds of ways. I mean, you see it manifest in domestic violence, you see it manifest in drug and alcohol abuse. I always tell the story that my most recent apartment in Sarajevo, we lived across from the second gymnasium in Sarajevo, which is one of the main high schools in the city. Every morning I would wake up, head off to work, and what was waiting for me in front of my front door, it was needles and fentanyl packets, right? Those kids have nowhere to go. And so they stay at home or they go to the shisha bars. So if you're thinking about where does the inculcation of new beliefs, new ideas, new practices take place, it has to be in physical spaces. It has to be in places where they can be away from their communities that, which is not to say the communities are bad, but in so much as those communities impose reactionary, regressive attitudes on them, you need to break them away from that. And this is where we also start talking about a really, really great point that I'm so glad Agon made, that notion of venture capital vis-a-vis civil society. Really creating those spaces where not just, kids can congregate away from their parents, et cetera, but they can also learn things like programming and all the kinds of new technologies, new formats that are coming up, which incidentally is also why IT is one of the growth industries in the region, because it's not affected by government, exactly. And it's something that you can do digitally, without the need for this kind of hardware and
I think
concrete
it definitely matches your point on partnering with private businesses, the private sector, and we have a question right here. And while you're asking, I'm going to take a picture of our impressive audience because this is really great.
Thank you so much. My name is Morgan Burns. I was just hoping you could help me understand, Agon, what you mean by populism and why it's a bad thing. Yasmin, you said also, you alluded to the Balkan elites in relation to my question also. And Agon, in your previous comment, you mentioned these coalition building, these ideas, these movements that span across just single issues. So could you help me understand how that's not populism and further why you think populism is a bad thing? Thank you.
Right here, we have a young student from Macedonia.
Christian Fedanovsky, Georgetown University. I have one question for Mr. Maliqi. You mentioned that the opposition in Serbia nowadays is less than perfect, but you also celebrated the success of protests in North Macedonia a couple of years ago. In North Macedonia, the opposition also wasn't perfect by any means, but we presented a united front and we managed to get rid of an authoritarian government at the end. So my question is, by saying, well, you know, in Serbia there is Dveri, there is Vuk Jeremic, so wouldn't like these protests because these people are part of them, isn't that taking away from the legitimate fight for democracy by those Serbian citizens who have been, you know, taking to the streets in Serbia for the last couple of months?
I think Yasmin will have something to say about this too, not just Agon. And gentlemen, or actually, do you mind if I take the question from this young lady here first?
Hi, Michaela Hill. We've been talking a lot. The panel has been
Just introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, Michaela Hill.
Oh, okay.
The panel has been talking a lot about how increasing democratic resiliency through international intervention, United States, the EU, but how do we empower that development in the Balkans, specifically grassroots developments? How do we move forward in creating that civic consciousness that we know is so important for democracy?
Agon, would you like to start with the first one? And
Yeah, I'll start with the question on the opposition in Serbia. I mean, fair point, but I understand the frustration of my Serbian friends, quite a lot of them who are sometimes taking part in the protests. But I'm not enthusiastic personally as a person from the region, with the kind of alternative that, and this is, I don't think it's the same situation as North Macedonia at all, because there was a clear cleavage and dividing line, and what was at stake was very clear. The opposition wanted to make sure, to get rid of state capture, but then also deliver on a very pure pro-European agenda, which they did. I'm not sure this is the kind of opposition in Serbia that will deliver on what Serbia needs to do in terms of both regional politics, sort of, resolving Kosovo dispute. I don't see them as an actor who would be able to deliver on that, and that's bad for Serbia, not just for Kosovo, but that's bad for Serbia. On populism, I would.
can you actually let me turn over to
Yeah.
Yasmin also to maybe weigh in on the Serbian question, and then we can come to populism. And I also don't want to ignore Mali. If you have something to say,
I
please
have
let me
something
know.
to say about
Okay.
populism.
Okay, so let's
wanna take up that,
let's start with the Serbian opposition and why it's different or not different.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, I'll answer kind of the populism and protest question together, because I think they actually speak to the same thing, and we can see it directly in the Serbian case. The fact that there are movements that, for instance, articulate populist concerns, or the fact that there are movements that take to street politics, in and of itself is not telling us anything. That protests and populism are political methodologies. They are not themselves ideological projects. The United States has a long history of protests and populism. Teddy Roosevelt was a populist president. It's the matter of what you do with that populist energy. And I think what Agon is gesturing to, and what the concern that realistically I also have as somebody who's written about and is generally very sympathetic and takes the view that protest culture is absolutely vital to the creation of functional democratic polities, and something that we have historically lacked in the Western Balkans. That having been said, it has to be said that many of the visible elements that appear to be part of the protest movements in Serbia are what we would otherwise refer to as reactionary, ultranationalist, and I would even go so far as, if we take seriously their ideas, as being anti-democratic, right? I mean, they are using protests as a method to achieve what I think in the end would be ultimately anti-democratic outcomes. That's the issue. And that, again, is also the difference with what we saw happen in North Macedonia. To put it very bluntly, the proof is in the pudding. Yes, the current government in North Macedonia rose to power largely on the back of the colorful revolution and the whole sort of broader set of events that happened in North Macedonia. But once gaining power, they showed themselves to be genuinely committed, with some issues on the sides, let's acknowledge them, nevertheless to be broadly committed to the project of genuine democratization in North Macedonia. That is not what we're seeing in Serbia. So I don't think it's hypocritical, as it were, to be cognizant of this and say, even as somebody, again, very sympathetic to protests and social movements, to say, hang on, this is not quite the same thing.
On populism?
Yeah, so, and if I could just jump in a little bit on the protests, I would also say, I mean, it's always important in this part of the world to, you know, look carefully at, are these movements homegrown, or to what extent are they homegrown as well, and what other influences may be contributing. You know, I don't have a clear answer in this case on what the percentages are, but I think it's worth considering. On populism, I mean, I would just say, I think sometimes when we say populism, we do it because we don't want to say nationalism. And, you know, let's call a spade in some of these cases. I would also say, you know, populism, you know, it's a tactic. It's give the people what they want. It's junk food. We may like it, but it's probably not good for us, right? And in most of these cases, it's not what we, you know, what we've all been talking about in terms of institution building, in terms of, you know, fighting corruption, in terms of all of these things that you need to do to build a healthy, functioning, you know, democratic society. When you look at what populism generally is, it's, you know, basically giving people things the state can't afford, often, or pursuing policies, you know, that are nationalist in nature. These aren't the kind of prudent policies that, you know, often are tough medicine, but are what countries like those in the Western Balkans actually need to do to, you know, get higher on that Freedom House score. So I think we just have to be careful about the vocabulary, and then we have to be careful about, you know, comparing what is it that, you know, the roadmap should be to achieve the kind of society and the kind of democracy that, you know, we all want to see in the Western Balkans, and does this match up? And if it does, great. But if it doesn't, you know, the sugar high doesn't last very long, and you end up, you know, crashing.
Did you want to say?
No, I think they captured it.
Okay, great, because we do have, I want to go back to that gentleman, yes, that was so gracious earlier. This is going to be our last round of questions, just so you know, because it's 4:29.
Austin Doller, Center for European Policy Analysis. We spoke about China as the threat with economic means but kind of political ends. What does a Western response to this threat look like practically? Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? One right there.
Hi. Sean McGuire, Simpson Center. Agon mentioned earlier on growing the constituency, like in the Balkans, of people who care about liberal democracies. But how are we growing the constituency here in not only Washington, but in the United States, about people who care about what's happening in the Balkans? American attention to the war in Bosnia peaked at 23% of respondents in May 1993, and throughout the entirety of our operations there, over 60% of Americans still oppose the notion of the U.S. having a responsibility. There's thankfully not a war going on over there, but how do you turn around to the American people now and explain there how are representatives going to particularly Bill Clinton, 1992, 1991, hammered Bush Sr. on his inaction in Bosnia. And would you see that, or would you see the Balkans and U.S. weakness there than being perhaps a focal point or point for Democratic candidates to focus on? And the second question, I'm sorry, this comes from personally knowing a lot of friends, particularly from Serbia and Republic of Srpska. How do you deal with people who essentially, in my respect, in my view, have been indoctrinated, who in every respect you may view them as entirely progressive? They support gay rights, they support LGBT, they support a tax policy, I like all these things, but then I mention Kosovo, but then I mention Republic of Srpska, and then all of a sudden, everything else that they've done is out the door, that they've only known one history for their entire life. That yesterday was the anniversary of Operation Flash. And how many of my Serbian friends, not Serbians from Croatia, but Serbians from Serbia, posted things on there, and they said things that about Croatian people, and then they went around and hang out with a Croatian friend later that day. What do we do with that just indoctrinated, just latent, I suppose, nationalism? Don't even realize.
Great. Okay, last question right here.
I'll speak loud.
The live stream. Because of live stream, we would like you to speak in the microphone, because otherwise our viewers online won't hear your question.
Graham Scott from IRI.
Oh yeah, we can hear you very well.
So earlier the panelists had talked about how Balkan elites are willing to really adapt to whoever the funder is in terms of the ideology. in DC, we often talk about a competition of ideas between the U.S. and the Western world and Russia and China. But for the Balkan leaders, is it really more of a competition of just who's willing to write out checks the easiest versus a competition of ideas?
Okay, and with that, we'll close the questions from the audience, and in your responses, maybe make some concluding remarks as well, so that we don't stay too late.
Okay, I'll
Feel
just
free,
pick up,
whichever order you
I'll
would
just
like.
pick up on two of the issues here. How do we build a constituency in DC here? I think one of the things that resonates very well when I talk to people in DC here about the Balkans, especially after a lot of foreign policy problems and issues that the US has had in a lot of parts of the world, the Balkans were sort of had quite a happy ending, at least at the time. Right now we're in trouble, but it's a US foreign policy success story. And I think when you tell people this, you know, I think it makes them feel good, and I think this it's a good argument to use to get people to care about you know, maintaining or sustaining one area of the world that has seen, you know, quite a lot of good from the U.S. On the issue of China and you know, we've had this Berlin process for the past 5 years in the region, which was meant to provide a lot of, including financial impetus on regional projects, on infrastructure, you know, but you know, then come the Chinese with no conditions, no governance conditions, and and not a lot of these technical processes. And I think the West has failed in sort of bringing in more money in the game and delivering more on the infrastructure as well, because we've not seen anything, especially from the European side, despite a lot of the promises. We've not seen any financial impetus or given to the region, despite a lot of the talk. You pointed out a key issue of the history. You know, people still kind of being bogged down into national narratives. How do we tackle that? If you look at the Serbian media nowadays, there is a state-sponsored, you know, media campaign inciting hate against all of the regional countries. The autocrats need to keep this alive. They are not going to change history books. They're not going to change you know, they're going to try to increase, you know, this national hysteria, and they've gotten a free pass. Nobody has said a word on them. Serbia has been opening chapters with the EU, you know, in the accession process, and nobody has said a word about the hate speech in the media. Now they've started to notice a little bit that this is a problem. But you have pointed out to something very important, and that's why I feel that solving these bilateral disputes and these, you know, especially Kosovo, Serbia, will also be fundamentally important for that, because we will leave these things in the past, and then it will stop being something that is politicized and abused by political elites, and then we will start a bit more of a social process of dealing with the past, which we didn't touch upon here, about transitional justice and about war victims. You know, the conflict is alive because victims are still alive. You know, and they haven't seen justice. I was just 2 days ago, Congress here had in the House Foreign Affairs Committee had a hearing on Kosovo on justice, on the impunity that victims in Kosovo have, especially the victims of rape. 20,000 women who have been raped during the war have not seen anybody charged and for any of the crimes. And this is a problem also in Bosnia and throughout the region. So as long as people have these not just written histories but live histories and traumas, I don't think we will be able to have full reconciliation and full sort of peace in the Balkans.
Great. Well, I guess I would answer maybe a number of these questions by, you know, talking a little bit about how I approach this question of how do you get the White House's interest and, you know, a new administration's interest in the Balkans. And for me, it was all about the value proposition. You know, I can't think of a region that is so strategic, where so little, you know, money or high-level attention will make a bigger difference. And so that was when we looked at travel for the vice president in 2017. That was the case I made to him. Was we can do a summit in Montenegro. You'll meet all of the leaders of the region, and you know, our embassies can then sort of feed off of this for years, because that's what a big difference having, you know, high-level U.S. attention in the region can make. And so, you know, I think that's still true. And as as an American, I'm an optimist. It's something that, made me stand out when I was living in the region. But, I would say when I look at where we were 2 years ago, at the time, I was re-engaging with these issues after some time away, and I thought, good God, we're in terrible shape, and it looks like there could be, violence in any number of places, and everything is headed in the wrong direction. We're in a very different place now. There are areas that are very concerning. We haven't talked enough about Bosnia today, unfortunately. But we also have a Montenegro, that's a member of NATO. We have the name agreement, or the name issue resolved. And what that does is it basically takes, those two countries, particularly as North Macedonia hopefully gets into NATO very soon, hopefully starts accession talks. I'm still an EU optimist. But, it takes those places off the board and allows us to focus even, greater attention on the places where we need it, like Bosnia, like Kosovo, Serbia. So, I just think it's an area where just a little bit of effort and attention and money, does make a big difference. And we get a lot more bang for our buck than the Chinese or the Russians do, because we have the history with the region, we have the relationships, and it still matters.
Great. I will just only point out on the Bosnia discussion, I think that the Kosovars in the audience and online are probably saying, thank God, it's not Bosnia all the time anymore. We get to talk about Kosovo a little bit. Point taken. Thank you so much.
So I think I'll try to, so many valuable points, I think, raised by Molly there in particular. I think I'll tackle the questions sort of on two levels. One is kind of the U.S. and international level, and one is the local level, and that'll speak to, I think, everything that we've heard today. From the perspective of what can the United States do and what can the international community do, especially vis-a-vis a region that, realistically speaking, most of the American public is never going to particularly care about, that's where leadership matters. And that's where it's the job for our representatives and folks on the Hill and senators, as well as folks who are going to be competing for the presidency, and just people in political life, to make the American public understand, not specifically about, I think, even the Western Balkans per se, but I think more broadly what we've seen take place over the last 2.5, 3 years, this notion that bad things happen when America leaves the world. Right? American leadership is critical, and America helped. Look, I teach undergrads, and I speak in very colorful language about really the remarkable and historical role that this country has played in two pivotal moments, 1945 and 1989. America twice recreated the world for all intents and purposes, and did so in a fashion that gave up a significant degree of primacy that another superpower would have used to kind of spike the proverbial football. Because that's not the kind of country that the United States is, because it believes in institutions, values, norms, and principles. And that is the kind of language that we need to hear more of from our American friends and colleagues, right? That is the story that gets so much traction, in particular in a place like the Western Balkans. And this is the linchpin, because we want to be like you. We really, really do. And Molly's absolutely right. The role that the United States in particular has played in places like Bosnia and Kosovo, there's a good reason why, America is America in the eyes of so many Bosnians and so many Kosovars. It's because of the values and the norms and the history. And then in particular, I think to the really valuable question about, for us from the region, even though those of us like myself who are, a diaspora, I don't want to be misunderstood. I think survivors and folks who went through horrible experiences, and all of us did to some extent or another, we have a right and we have a responsibility to tell our stories, and we have a right and responsibility to tell the stories of those who cannot. In particular, when we're thinking about the 20,000 raped women and sexually assaulted in Kosovo and also in Bosnia. That having been said, those of us in this room who have power and privilege and access also have a different kind of responsibility. And that's the responsibility to engage in conversation and to create, I'll use the term again, a certain kind of safe space and dialogue among our friends, our peers, our cousins, our neighbors, to tell their stories and to say, I hear your pain. And those are difficult conversations. Those are frustrating conversations. Those conversations end in fights and screaming matches. But if you come back to them and if you show commitment, if you show passion, if you show affection, if you show love, you can make progress. You really, really can. And I mean, I don't want to get all religious on us or anything. I'm not at all. But there's a reason why people gravitate to stories of mercy, hope, and forgiveness, because that's the only thing that you can do when you have gone through the kinds of experiences that this entire region has gone through.
That's a lovely note to end on. Thank you all so much. This was a great discussion. I certainly have enjoyed it, and I would then like to invite my lovely audience that has stuck with us for 13 extra minutes to join me in thanking the panelists for this